Hello, how are you doing? The publishers Faber and Faber had what I think is quite a fun idea in that they asked 10 different independent bookshops what their book of the year is, and booksellers often read so widely. They have really interesting and unique suggestions, and they're so passionate about their recommendations. So I wanted to go through this list to see which of these books I've read, which I've been meaning to read, and which I might not have heard of before. This is also a really great way to make a list of bookshops that I really ought to visit. There's a whole wide variety of bookshops represented here from around the UK and Ireland, and I think I've only been to one or two of these bookshops. So in the new year, I definitely want to travel to some of these. They'd also asked these booksellers for what books they'll be reading over the Christmas period, which books they'll be giving as gifts, and what old favorites they'll be returning to. But I'm just going to focus on their books of the year in this video, but I'll put a link to their article below so you can check it out and see what other books that they're recommending. Now, first off, there is a bookshop which is quite close to my heart, and that it's the Book Hive in Norwich, here in England. And Norwich is somewhere where I moved to first when I first came to the UK a long time ago, and when I started studying at the University of East Anglia. And Norwich, I'm being very American there, Norwich is a lovely, fine city. It's a really beautiful little city out in East Anglia, and so and I visited this shop a number of times. Now, they recommend a novel that I've been really meaning to get to, which is The Glutton by A.K. Blakemore, and I was lucky enough to hear this author speak at an event earlier this year, and this sounds so interesting because it's based on a true story from French history of a man who could just eat and eat in an infinite way, and but he was very thin, and so he was known as like the Great Glutton. And this was towards the end of the 18th century in France. It was during a time of revolution, and so we follow his story as he gains notoriety around the country. Sounds so intriguing. And I read Blakemore's previous novel, The Manningtree Witches, which is really dark and atmospheric, and I'm sure this novel is going to be the same. The next recommendation comes from Drop City Books in Hanley, and their book of the year is Where I End by Sophie White, which is a novel about a woman who lives on an island where she's always lived. She's never left there, but she's always wanted a family, and she feels very constricted by her circumstances. She has a bedbound mother who is silent, but when a female artist and her children move to the island, she thinks she discovers an outlet for her love. Now, the bookseller Ruth says that this is island folk horror, but it has some real stuff to say about motherhood, family, mortality, disability, and small town vibes. Little Acorns Bookstore in Derry recommends The Letters of Seamus Heaney. This is a poet who died about a decade ago, and he was from this area around this bookshop. And this is a compilation of letters that he wrote throughout his life. So it's his thoughts and reflections on both his own experiences and politics and writing. And he is such a famous poet, but I think I've only read a couple of his poems in my life. So I'm not all that keen on reading his letters. I'm sure they're great and really interesting, but also this book is over 800 pages long, and I don't think I'd have anywhere on my shelves for it. So I think this is a book for real, like, hardcore fans of this poet. Shalimar Books in South London recommends Mother of Strangers by Suad Amiry. This is a novel which has a fable-like structure, but it's also a historical novel because it's set in Jaffa in the years 1947 and 1951, following the story of a young couple who fall in love, but how their lives are disrupted by by indiscriminate bombing in Jaffa and the displacement of Palestinian families. So this sounds like a very timely story. The Portobello Bookshop in Edinburgh is a lovely store that I visited a number of years ago when I went to the Edinburgh Book Festival, and their book of the year is Biography of X by Lacey, which is also one of my favorites. This story is so inventive and fascinating because Lacey comes up with this alternate history of America, but she tells it through the story of a woman who is the widow of a notorious experimental artist, and this artist has died, and her widow is telling the story of her life and trying to reconstruct her very complicated history by interviewing a number of individuals. And in doing so, she meets and interacts with a number of famous real-life historical figures, as well as a whole range of fascinating fictional characters. So I just loved reading this. West Kirby Bookshop recommends the debut novel Kala by Colin Walsh. This is described as a literary thriller about three longtime friends who meet up to discuss the disappearance of their friend Kala, who vanished many years ago, but her remains have just been discovered. So there's renewed interest in this case. Now, I have to admit, I'm somewhat prejudiced against reading this novel, not because of the sound of it or the author, but because I went to a book event a couple of months ago in which the author read, and he gave a great reading. It sounded really interesting, but a literary agent came up to me and asked me if I'd read Kala yet, and I said, no, I haven't had time to get to it yet. And she said, oh, Eric, then you're not up on current literature if you've not read this novel. And that just really got my goat. I don't like it when people say, oh, you have to have read this book, or you don't understand current literature. That is such a snobbish point of view, and immediately makes me not want to read the book. So I'm sure this is a great novel. I do want to read it, but I do have this just feeling about it having had this experience. Shelf Life in Cardiff, which is a great name for a bookshop, recommends the novel Split Tooth by Tanya Tagaq, and this is about an Indigenous girl in Canada who is dealing with a lot of real world issues to do with alcoholism and boredom and bullying, but also she feels this strong connection with the spiritual world. But when she becomes pregnant, she has to renegotiate her position in her community. This is a novel I've been meaning to get to, and it's fairly short, so I'm hoping to read it before the end of the year. Sam Reed Bookseller in Grasmere recommends the novel Bad Cree by Jessica Johns, which is a book I hadn't heard of before, but which is also set in Canada. It's about a young Cree woman who thinks she's left behind her community that she grew up in and her family, but then she has very intense and vivid dreams about crows that sound quite surreal and strange, and this provokes her to revisit her family and deal with a lot of the issues that she thought she had left behind. Redline Books in Colchester recommends Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. This wonderful novel about two friends, two kind of outsiders who find love in each other through friendship and through a business they create together in gaming. And this story is so gripping and such a pleasure to read. I just loved it. And finally, The Bound in Whitley Bay has two book recommendations from two booksellers. First, Emma recommends Every Exquisite Thing by Laura Steve, which is a young adult retelling of the novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, which I love that novel, but I hadn't heard heard that there was this YA retelling of it, but that sounds so intriguing. I'd be really keen to see what this is like. And then Helen recommends the novel Cuddy by Benjamin Myers, which is a book I've been really meaning to get to. This story is both a fictional reimagining of the life of Saint Cuthbert, who is the unofficial patron saint of the North, but also follows a number of different characters over the centuries and how their lives kind of strangely interact with this saint or have a kind of connection to it. And it all centers around this particular cathedral. And this novel won the Goldsmiths Prize this year, which is an award for more kind of experimental fiction. And I've just loved reading Benjamin Myers fiction in the past, and this book just sounds like a masterpiece. So I'm really looking forward to reading it, as well as some of these other books. I'd love to know if you have read any of these books, if you would recommend them, or if you're interested in reading any of them now, please let me know in the comments below. But also, if someone said to you, what is your book of the year? What is the one book you would pick? Please let me know what that would be. I'd love to hear about that. But I hope you're doing well and reading good things and visiting some great independent bookshops. And I'd love to know too if you've visited any of these bookshops before, because I want to get to a number of them. But I will speak to you again soon. Bye-bye.